Thanks, Dave and Mike. We are joined today with Professor Jack Powers to talk to us about television production. Thanks, Jack, for coming in.
You're welcome.
Thank
it's
you.
my pleasure.
Great. Want to get started?
Sure.
All right. So what experience do you have in television production?
Well, I've been fortunate enough to get involved with a TV show before it became a big hit, and that show's Modern Family. So I've been able to go out there. I go out there sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a season, and so I get to hang out as the shows get produced literally from story breakout to finished product after editing. So.
All right, so since you knew the creators of Modern Family, can you describe the process of how a show is pitched and how it all comes together?
What typically happens is I did get a chance to pitch a show. So what typically happens is this. When you pitch a show, you've got 3 different groups that you can typically pitch to. You can either pitch to a network, you can either pitch to a studio, or you can pitch to an agency. In each case, they kind of do the same thing. If you pitch to an agency, the agency represents you, and they try to sell your show to a network or a studio. If you pitch to the studio or the network, they kind of do the same thing. The studio, of course, will produce it and then try to sell it to a network, or network, in many cases, will have some kind of an affiliation with the studio, and they'll produce it and ostensibly to air it on their own network, but sometimes to air it on a different network. So I did get a chance to pitch a show to CAA, which they did not buy, pitching is, you typically only get about 5 minutes, and you have to make a pretty good case. In addition to the 5 minutes, though, you don't even get in the door if you don't already have some kind of a contact where people have heard things about you or somebody knows you. It's clearly like, they just don't let people off the street pitch TV shows. So in this particular case, it was without question, because of the contacts I had at Modern Family, that I got a chance to pitch a TV show, and I pitched a drama. I thought it would be an interesting idea to imagine somebody like Dr. Gregory House from House, who's an atheist like House, but have him be the head of some kind of a religious institution. And I thought you could have a lot of conflict with that. But it didn't matter because they didn't buy it. You only get about 5 minutes, but you do get to give them a little synopsis or treatment in advance, and it's based on that they determine whether or not they want to meet with you. Pitching is pretty good. Typically, once you pitch, though, if the show is bought, even if you pitch the idea, it's unlikely that they're going to allow you to be a showrunner unless you've already garnered experience as a showrunner with somebody else's show. So in the case of Modern Family, it was pitched and co-created by 2 individuals, Chris Lloyd and Steve Levitan. These 2 had a long history, and so they were able to, I think that history helped them to come up with the idea, and then also helped them to get the show sold, because they already had a track record.
Right.
So.
Cool. So what's the writer's room atmosphere like?
Most sitcoms have about 10 full-time writers. Sometimes, give or take a few, because sometimes you have writing teams. And a writing team would be, if the 2 of you wanted to be a writing team, perhaps one of you is good at telling a story and the other is good at telling jokes. So together you make a good team. So as a result, sometimes you have more than 10, but roughly right around 10. And those individuals, with each passing day, you sit around this room. It is a collaborative process. The idea I think that a lot of people get is that writing TV is solitary, much like writing a novel. It is nothing like that at all. Everything is done in a group. Typically, I'll just outline the process.
Sure.
Typically what will happen is this. You first have a breakout session. And a breakout session is when the writers, and in television, writers are producers and producers are writers. So writer-producers come up with the concepts for what they want to do. For example, at Modern Family, they'll be breaking out the stories for next season, for season 4, and they'll do the entire arc for the season. What's going to happen to each of the families, each of the characters over the next year. So they break out some overarching themes for the next season. Then they break out individual stories, and it's their goal to come up with about 25. So 25 different episodes, and then, of course, inside each episode, 3 or 4 independent stories. So you roughly need 75 to 100 different ideas, and the tricky part is you want them to be original and relatable and something that hasn't been done on television before. So it's not an easy thing to come up with this. So the stories get broken out. Once the stories get broken out, the stories are assigned to writers. Sometimes writers will work together. You might assign 2 or 3 writers to an episode, sometimes just 1. You go off and you work, again, perhaps by yourself, sometimes with another person, sometimes with 2 other people, and you hammer out the outline. That's usually about 11 to 12 pages with little to no dialogue, maybe some sample dialogue, but that's it. Once that is done, you turn that into the showrunners, and the showrunners look at it, and if they think it's okay, they will tell you. Otherwise, they'll say, you have problems with the story, we need you to redo this, revise the outline, or you're given another day or 2 to do that. Then it comes back. Once they give it the okay, they assign you to write the script, and you're given sometimes 5 days to write the script, sometimes a little more than that, depending on how much trouble you're having. So you write the script, usually within a working week. Once the script is ready, it goes back to the showrunners. The showrunners will give you notes on it, and then it goes back to you, and you have to rewrite it. And you engage in that process until they say it's okay, because ultimately it's their show. And because it's their show, what they say goes. So you might have the world's greatest idea, but if they don't want it in there, you have to take it out, because their heads will roll if it doesn't work, not yours. You're just literally a plebe who works for them. So once they find it acceptable, they say, okay, it's ready for the room. And at that point, the draft gets released to the room, where it gets ripped to shreds by everybody who says, this is shit, this is no good, nobody likes this, I can't believe they got past the showrunners, etc. And then sometimes they'll go, but this is pretty good. That one's good. This joke is pretty funny. I haven't seen that before. And at that point, everybody pitches in. They go line by line, word for word, or word by word, to make it as tight and as funny as possible. And they're mostly, at this point, trying to capture character voices. They're mostly trying to make sure that it's relatable, that it's funny. Being funny is paramount for a sitcom, of course. And this is what they do. And they work and work. Once that reaches the point where all the writers have given notes, the person who was assigned the script then has to incorporate all those notes into a second draft of the script. Once that's done, it goes back to the room where they do the same thing again, and it gets returned back to the writer. Then it goes back, and when the room says it's okay, it goes back to the showrunners. The showrunners will then give their final notes, and if they say, okay, here's what we still need you to do, you make those changes, it comes back, now it's ready for a table read. And the table read is when the actors come in, they sit around a table, the same table that the writers typically write, and then they read the script. At this point, during a table read, you have the actors participate. You also have the studio representatives participate. You also have the network representatives participate. And everybody gives notes. So if you are an established actor on an established TV show, you're allowed to give notes. If you're Ed O'Neill, who plays the character of Jay on Modern Family, you can give notes because you've worked in the business for 25 years, people respect you, they think you know what you're doing. That's fine. If you are a child actor, you should just shut up and just deliver the lines as written. Nobody will pay any attention to your notes.
So Nolan Gould doesn't get to give any notes?
It doesn't stop them from trying. So when little kids try to give the notes, they often will just, people will appease them, okay, and then not change it. But if you're Julie Bowen or now Sofia Vergara, you can give notes, and that's perfectly acceptable. In addition to the actors giving notes, the network gives notes, the studio gives notes, everybody gives notes. And then it goes back to the writer's room. And back in the room, you have to take the actor's notes, the studio's notes, and the network executive's notes, and then you have to incorporate all of them so that everybody's happy. Once that is done, everybody gets to check it off and say, okay, it's all right. Then it's called the shooting draft. At that point, it goes to the director of that episode, and then they'll obviously schedule the locations, the studios, everything that you need, and the director will use the shooting draft. As a rule of thumb, you'll always have the showrunner plus whoever was assigned that script to be on set or on location during the shooting, so that if there's a rewrite necessary for a scene, you have the writers there. So there's always two, the showrunner plus whoever was assigned. And if more than two people were assigned, it's expected they'll both be there. So if two were assigned to an episode, they'll be there, plus one of the showrunners will be there. Most shows only have one showrunner. In some cases, you have two, where they just share the duties. So that's what happens. Once that's done, once they have actually shot the episode, it goes back to the studio, back to the network for approval. And if they all give it approval after it's edited and the music is all done and post-production is done, then we're good to go and it gets scheduled to air. In some cases, it's horrible, people get upset, people fight about certain things, and you have to make amends. And in some cases you have to reshoot, you have to rewrite a scene, the writers get called in and have to work till 2 in the morning to completely rewrite it. Those are not good days. You don't want that to happen. But it does happen.
Yeah.
It does happen sometimes. And then you have to appease entities that don't always agree with each other. In many cases, the studio that produces the show is competing with and cooperating with the network that airs it. So for example, in the case of Modern Family, you've got ABC, the network, owned by Disney, but it's produced by 20th Century Fox, owned by News Corp. So News Corp and the Disney Corporation are direct competitors for everything they do. But for the purpose of Modern Family only, they are partners. And so what happens when a writer comes up with something pithy and funny, but it sort of mocks a Disney film? Well, ABC's not going to allow that. What happens if they come up with something and it references a 20th Century Fox show? Well, if it's a positive show or a positive spin on the show, 20th Century Fox is all for it. If it's negative, they want it out. But if you do put in something for 20th Century Fox, Disney doesn't like that. And they say, no, we want that out. Why don't you use a Disney show instead? So this is and you have to play these games. People get frustrated because of who makes what film, who makes what TV show, who owns which record label in terms of the music that you use in any given episode. So all of these things have to be meted out. In addition to that, you've got, of course, both the studio and the network making deals for product placements and story integration. So all of this has to play a role too. It's a laborious process, but the writers are handsomely paid for what they do. They're very good at what they do, and as a result, they work long hours. They typically get to the writer's room by about 10 o'clock in the morning. They do that to avoid traffic, by the way. But in some cases, they'll stay until midnight. They do not work weekends. They don't work Saturdays or Sundays. But other than that, it's expected you stay until the job is done, not any set hours. So that's typically how it goes.
So for inspiring writers, what do they need to do? What is a spec script? How do they get it into the right hands?
It starts with a spec script, and a spec script is just that. You write an episode of an already existing TV show on spec. Nobody pays you for it. You take as much time as you need to get it into a shape so that you're proud of it. Writing the spec script, though, is in and of itself a tricky business. You have to, in effect, choose a show that's popular among people that work in TV, not necessarily popular to the masses. In fact, I would suggest to any aspiring writer not to do that. Don't pick a popular show just because it's popular. Pick a show that the people who make television or write for television, that they watch, that they like.
So would it be better to write a spec for like an Emmy-winning show like 30 Rock or?
Yes, I think so. I don't know if the Emmys are always the best choice, but definitely the Writers Guild Awards. You should look at those and see what they pick. And for example, in today's marketplace, I would say a show like Community is highly respected by people who watch or write television. They like Community, so I would definitely pick Community as an option. Everybody requires 2 specs. One spec should be a show that is definitely not past its prime, but also not too popular yet. So right now, something like Community would be an excellent choice. In addition, people want to see, can you also create an original spec? So those are the 2. If you were an aspiring writer, you should first write a spec for an existing show. Again, that other people like, but that isn't too popular and isn't past its prime, but is on the air right now. That's number 1. And number 2, an original comedy spec. So because if you can write an original comedy spec, what it means is you can give voice to characters and tell a story. In effect, it suggests that you can write for any TV show, if you can do that well. You need both. There are some showrunners who prefer original specs. There are other showrunners that prefer the specs for already existing shows. But everybody requires more than one spec, so you need to have. If you spend 2 months working on a spec, you might get it to be in a position where you're proud of it. And other people might read it and say, this is pretty good. Then they say, what else do you have? And you need to have something else. One spec is never enough. 2 would be ideal.
Cool. And then, then you have a spec.
Yeah, all right, so now you have a spec. So now what do you do? It's not easy. It is extremely difficult. I like to tell aspiring writers this, just to give them a little dose of reality. There are more professional baseball players than there are writers on hit TV shows, and that puts things in perspective. Nobody thinks it's easy to become a Major League Baseball player, but a lot of people think, oh, I can write. Anybody can write. What you find out is it's not easy. When people try to write, they come to the conclusion, oh, it's not nearly as easy as I thought it was. And writing television is no exception. In some cases, it's much more difficult than writing novels because you have such tight deadlines. Okay, but let's say none of that bothers you. You want to be a writer, you're born to be a writer, you're driven to be a writer, you move out to Los Angeles, you have 2 excellent spec scripts, now what do you do? And the answer is you have to get representation. No showrunner or producer will even look at your script if you're not already represented by an agency. And then it's the old catch-22. An agency is not interested in you unless you have already established credentials, and a show will not look at your work unless you're represented by an agency. How do you do this? You have to bust through the big, thick fence that exists, and you have to chip away until there's a little crack, and then you get in. How do you do this? You establish contacts with people in the industry. You work as a production assistant on TV shows. You intern at popular TV shows where you get to meet some of the writers. You become a writer's assistant or an executive assistant to an executive producer. You do whatever is necessary. You take a job in catering so that the people who are in a position to help you, you know them personally. People in the business get inundated with spec scripts daily, and they hate it by strangers. However, if it's Emily in catering who has a spec, and you like Emily, and Emily has been a wonderful person to be around for the past year, well, you'll read hers, and that's typically how it works. You get on the ground floor there, you make contacts, and they'll read it. They'll give you notes, you'll take that, and then hopefully, eventually, one of those people in the business will say, I can help you get an agent. And in that case, if they give a referral to their agency, then the agent will almost always pick you up. For example, Steve Levitan, co-creator of Modern Family, if he says, hey, I want you to pick up Mike. Mike, he calls up his agent and say, hey, I'm sending someone your way. You might want to give him consideration. the agent would be a fool not to represent you because he doesn't want to lose the gravy train that is Steve Levitan. So that's typically what happens. Once that happens, then your foot is in the door and people will at least read your stuff. If they read your stuff and they think it's worthwhile, they will bring you in for a pitch. And in that case, you get to pitch an episode. And if you pitch an episode and they like it, they will assign you an outline. You'll be an outside writer. The Writers Guild, which is the organization that represents writers, it ensures that a certain percentage of all TV shows that are scripted are written by people who are not employed by the show or the studio. So as a result, you get outside people who get a chance. Otherwise, there would never be any turnover. So that happens. And so you get a chance. You get a chance to pitch. If they like your pitch, they'll give you the outline, they'll assign you the draft, and you do the same thing that we already talked about. And if that all works out splendidly, you get paid handsomely just for that episode, but at least now you've got a credential. You've got a written by credential on a TV show that was produced. With that, finding additional work, either as a freelance writer for a variety of TV shows or as a full-time staff writer is much, much easier. And ideally, you'll take a meeting, and when you take meetings, you meet with executive producers of TV shows. Hopefully one of them will hire you on staff. If you're, the phrase is looking to staff, and that means you're looking for a full-time writing position on a TV show. If that happens, then you are paid a full-time salary, you get the benefits, and you're on a TV show. With each passing year, the better you are at your job, the more experience you have, you get promoted. The lowest level writer is called staff writer, and then it goes all the way up to executive producer. That's the highest. As a rule of thumb, to be an executive producer, there's no set rule, but generally speaking, you need at least 10 to 20 years of full-time experience as a writer to reach that point. You start off as staff, and then you get promoted to story editor. There's all these different levels you can go. Eventually, assistant producer, associate producer, co-producer, co-executive producer, up to executive producer. It's difficult, but it is possible. And of course, the secret is, there's no secret. Writers get better the more they write. If you write all the time, you get better at it. If you take people's advice, people who know what they're doing, who have a lot of success, and take it to heart and make those changes and incorporate them, you get better at it. And over years, you get better. If you're always writing, always coming up with ideas, then it tends to work out for you. But it's not easy. And you're competing with people not only from the United States, but primarily from the English-speaking world. From all over the world. You'll find writers from lots of different countries too. So.
And so what are the day-to-day runnings of a showrunner and executive producer on a show? Like, what do they do day-to-day?
Yeah, a showrunner in many respects has a very high-stress job. It's the showrunner who's responsible, literally, for every facet of the show, from hiring the individual directors. In TV, directors are freelance, and so they'll have a pool of directors they choose from. Sometimes they'll have a guest director, but that's the showrunner's job. It's also the showrunner's job to hire and fire writers, and that's another gut-wrenching thing about being a writer, is that they get fired all the time. Virtually every successful writer in Hollywood has been fired at least once, in many cases way more than once. In addition to that, they have to placate, again, the network and the studio and the writing staff and the actors agents, the writers' agents, all of this. They negotiate. They negotiate all of the contracts. So the showrunner is responsible for every single facet of the show, including casting. Every TV show has guest actors. The producers, the low-level writers play no role in that, but the producers do play a role. So the casting director will work with the producers assigned to each episode, and in many cases the producers will have ideas as to who they would like to see cast in one particular role or another. But ultimately it's the showrunner's job to determine who gets cast in what part, not only as a regular recurring character, but also as a guest character in any given episode. But showrunners, they do everything, from deciding what to order for lunch, to who's going to be in what episode, to what writer gets fired, to what writer gets promoted, to what the contract negotiations will be like. All of it is done by the showrunner. It is a high-stress job. But if you do it well, the rewards are endless, to the tunes of, potentially, if your show makes it to syndication, hundreds of millions of dollars, if you're the creator of the show and own the show, which most creators of shows do. If that happens, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. So they're compensated accordingly.
Yeah, like for example, Jerry Seinfeld, Larry David, years after Seinfeld was over, they were still making millions and were the highest paid people in entertainment.
Yeah, it's expected that those two individuals will be the world's first billionaire comedians. Somebody who they both started off as stand-up comics, and eventually they'll both have a net worth of over $1 billion because of the success of Seinfeld. And in Larry David's case, Curb Your Enthusiasm plus Seinfeld. So
Awesome, pretty good. All right, so give us a typical week in television production.
everyone's got a different job. So a writer's typical week is a little different than, say, a director's typical week, than, say, an editor's typical week, etc. But it's a symbiotic relationship. They're all working together toward a goal of producing quality television that hopefully people will like. So a typical week, let's first approach it from a writer's point of view, and that is you might get assigned a story on a Monday with the expectation you'll get the outline in by, say, Tuesday or Wednesday morning, with then the expectation that you'll incorporate, get the revisions back in, perhaps produce the first draft by the end of that week. By the end of the second week, it would be assumed that you would have a shooting draft. The producers and writers are never working on just one episode. So you have all of these in the pipeline. So it's like an assembly line. As one gets finished, another one is almost finished, and then another one is there. So you always have one at the beginning stage, or a few at the beginning stages, some in the middle, and some nearing completion. While all of that's happening, you also have the show being produced. So on location, at the studio, on the different sets. So you have a location schedule and you have a shooting schedule. And in those cases, you have the actors knowing when they need to be here. The production coordinator handles all of this. And that individual has a pretty tough job too. So they handle all of that. So their job, of course, is spent mostly on the phone every day, of getting permits if it's on location, or setting everything up, letting all of the reps know for all of the actors where you need to be, when you need to be, how long we expect you to have to be there, what you want for lunch, all of these different things. So in any given week, you're at any stage of the process. You never just work together on one episode until it's done. You're always working on several episodes. The closest where it comes where you do work one episode at a time is the actors. The actors are the only ones who actually do that. They will do one episode at a time. When that one's done, they start the next one. But everybody else is working on multiple. Editors, well, except for the directors, they can't. But definitely the writers and the producers are always working on it. But a typical week is, the goal is that, for every week and a half, you can get an episode done. If you can do that, that's fantastic. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it takes 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes you can get one done in a week. That's rare, though, but it can happen. You take a hit show, and the general public typically doesn't understand that a hit TV show that's scripted might employ between the network, the studio, and the show 100 to 200 people working full-time to try to make 22 minutes of television per week. And everyone thinks that's easy, except for the people who do it, who know that's not the case. And of course, people who know television know, well, even making a 6-minute segment is a lot of work. But the people who don't, they don't grasp the concept of how much work it takes to get it done. So week by week, it does change, but roughly, the goal is to get 25 episodes done in a year. And so obviously, it takes longer than a week to complete an episode on average. And you know, there are 2 breaks. You get a break off in the fall months, typically after Thanksgiving until after New Year's. That's a break. And then you get another break, depending on when it goes. But typically, the break is in April. So you get an April break. And other than that, you know, you're back to work full-time.
And so we know you were an extra on an episode of Modern Family, but it did get cut. Can you describe what it was like being on set for that?
Yeah, it's long. In this case, it was on location. So yes, I was cast initially as a role of an usher at a Lakers game where I was supposed to catch the character Phil Dunphy trying to sneak in candy to a game when you're not allowed to do that. And it was all going well until frickin' Kobe Bryant intervened. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, it's a long process. We shot the scene probably 15 times. I would say, I guess about, you know, maybe 7 times just by myself, 7 times, or maybe 5 times with Kobe Bryant in a scene, and then a few extra times with just Kobe, and they decided to go with just Kobe. But it was actually an excellent experience. They let me hang out in the video village, which is typically not allowed. Actors usually aren't allowed in the video village. The video village is where the director, the assistant directors, and the first AD, second AD, third AD, where they all work. And it's, you know, mission control when you're on location. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. So you got to see the direction of all the actors. And then, of course, as a pseudo actor in that episode, you wear a wireless earpiece so the director can give you direction too. And they explain what to do. But on that day, I was on location for about 15 hours for one scene. And actually 2 scenes. You know, so my big scene got cut, which was unfortunate. But I'm still on camera, so at least you can still see me if you look for me. So I'm definitely still there. But it was a good experience. I enjoyed it, and it was nice. And you got to see how the actors approach their job. You know, it was kind of cool because I rode with the actors. They all thought I was an actor, so I didn't tell them, you know, that I was actually a PhD faculty member. I'm like, yeah, I'm an aspiring actor. That was my first trip out there, and since then they all know me, and so it's interesting. It is kind of funny, as an aside, they really don't know what's going on with me. I show up there, and I hang out with the creators of the show. So the last time I was there, Ty Burrell, who plays Phil Dunphy, he's like, "You're back," and I'm like, "Yeah." And then he's like, "Now, who do you work for again?" And I'm like, "Why?" And he's like, "Well, I assume you work for the studio, right?" And I'm like, "Sure, if you want to assume that." But they always think that I work for somebody else, the network or the studio. It just cracks me up. But now I know all of them, and it's different, so they kind of know, oh, the professor's back, which is very nice. But Modern Family has been incredibly wonderful to me. 3 people especially, Chris Lloyd, Steve Levitan, and Dan O'Shannon. Those are the 3. They're all executive producers of the show. You know, they gave me a nickname, so they call me Magic, so Magic Powers. And I'm hoping, you know, it's not done yet, it's not a done deal, but I'm hoping that they invite me back out for the story sessions in May. to provide story arcs for next year, because I really want to do that. I've had a chance to do that with some of them independently, but I've never had a chance to do that as a group, and I want to be a part of that as a group, because I think that would be excellent.
So what advice do you have for aspiring people to get into the television entertainment industry?
Okay, if you want to be a writer, my first bit of advice would be to pick up a book. It's sort of like, I think, the best book about writing for television comedies that exist. It's by Evan Smith, and it's called Writing Television Comedies. But he gives a step-by-step cookbook style illustration of what you need to do to make it. And he also, by the time you're done reading that book, you realize it's difficult, but not impossible. It's difficult, but not impossible. So that would be a first bit of advice. In terms of just working in the production, on the production side, below the line instead of above the line, move to Los Angeles. That's where the jobs are. That's where you have to go. I had a student in my office this morning, and she's fretting. She's graduating in May, and she's like, oh, what am I going to do? I don't want to move to Los Angeles without a job. So I said to her, what are you going to do if you stay here? And she said, well, I'll just work at Applebee's. I said, well, then what's to stop you from working at Applebee's in Los Angeles? Do that. If you're going to be broke in LA. LA is where the jobs are. It's where the contacts are. Fortunately, at Ithaca College, we have an incredible network of roughly 1,000 graduates working professionally in Los Angeles. Everywhere you go, you will meet people from Ithaca College. And people just intrinsically like to help other people. At one point, they were in a position where they needed help, and somebody gave it to them. And so they like to repay the favor. So step one, you have to move to Los Angeles. You have to just take the jump off the cliff. Your worst case scenario is that it doesn't work out. But that will never bother you as much as never going out and trying. You've got to try. Step two, the entry-level job for a TV show is production assistant. The title alone pretty much tells you you will do anything that's asked. You are a production assistant. What's production? Anything dealing with a TV show. So whatever is required, that's what you do. But that's the entry level. And Hollywood is full of people who got an entry-level PA job and then climbed the ranks and became showrunners. That's how it all starts. You become a PA, typically. That's one entry level. The other entry level would be a writer's assistant. But you have a lot of writers who were PAs. You have a lot of people who entered the production side who were writer's assistants. So they're not that different. They're parallel positions. But they are the entry-level positions. If you get one of those gigs, then your career in Hollywood starts. And if you want to be a writer, getting one of those gigs is immensely, it's the step you want to get.
Cool. All right, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, that's all the time we have. Back to you guys in the studio.